You have exposed the avoidance patterns through directly naming their behavior, through establishing consequences that demonstrate you will no longer tolerate their defended limitations, through implementing boundaries that threaten their comfortable position, through communicating clearly that you recognize their withdrawal and emotional unavailability, and their failure to meet basic relationship requirements. This exposure creates crisis for the avoidant because it eliminates their ability to continue patterns while maintaining your accommodation. You have made their defended behavior visible, rather than allowing it to operate invisibly. You have established that their patterns have consequences rather than being cost-free. You have demonstrated you will protect yourself rather than continuing to sacrifice yourself for their defended comfort. The exposure threatens to cost them your continued presence, your emotional investment, your patience that has allowed their patterns to persist without genuine accountability. Yet rather than responding to exposure through doing the genuine internal work that would address their patterns, rather than engaging in honest examination of their defensive limitations and committing to therapeutic process that would create real change, the avoidant typically responds through setting specific traps designed to restore your interest and your investment without requiring them to actually change their defended structure. These interest traps operate as tactical maneuvers that create appearance of change or appearance of genuine response to your exposure, while actually serving to buy the avoidant time, to neutralize your boundaries, to restore your hope that change is occurring when actually their defensive structure remains unchanged, and their patterns will resume once the immediate crisis of exposure passes. The traps are sophisticated because they provide exactly what you have been requesting: vulnerability, commitment to future, responsiveness to your needs. Yet these provisions are temporary performances rather than sustainable changes, strategic responses designed to manage your reaction to exposure rather than genuine shifts in their capacity or their patterns. Understanding these specific traps allows you to recognize when the avoidant is engaging in tactical manipulation versus genuine change, prevents you from being rehooked by performances that feel like progress but that actually serve to restore their comfortable position without requiring real transformation, protects you from sacrificing your boundaries in response to temporary shifts that will evaporate once you have been secured again. The traps work specifically because they activate your hope. Hope that your exposure finally broke through their defenses. Hope that they are finally recognizing what they are losing. Hope that genuine change is beginning that will transform relationship into sustainable, healthy partnership. Yet these traps are designed precisely to activate and exploit your hope while delivering no actual change, leaving you trapped in cycle where exposure generates temporary performance that restores your investment until patterns resume and necessitate another exposure that generates another temporary performance in endless cycle that prevents you from making clear decision to leave relationship that cannot meet your needs, regardless of how many times exposure generates brief performances of adequacy. Trap 1. The sudden vulnerability performance. They share deep feelings that evaporate within days. The avoidant responds to your exposure of their patterns with sudden, uncharacteristic vulnerability. They tell you they have been thinking about you constantly. They admit they have been struggling with the distance between you. They confess they recognize they have been emotionally unavailable. They share feelings they have never expressed before about caring for you or missing you or regretting their patterns. This vulnerability feels like breakthrough moment because throughout relationship, the avoidant has been emotionally guarded, has minimized their feelings, has avoided vulnerable expression about their internal experience. The sudden shift from defended distance to vulnerable sharing appears to indicate something has changed internally, that your exposure penetrated their defenses, that they are finally allowing you to see their authentic feelings that their defenses have concealed. The vulnerability performance typically includes specific elements designed to convince you it is genuine rather than strategic. They express feelings with apparent difficulty as if the sharing is genuinely challenging for them, creating impression that this vulnerability requires them to overcome significant internal resistance. They provide specific details about their internal experience, describing how they feel when you are not available, explaining what they miss about connection with you, articulating their fear about losing you, that make their sharing feel authentic rather than fabricated, They may show emotion through tears or voice breaking or visible distress that communicates intensity of feeling. They thank you for your patience or acknowledge your struggle with their patterns in ways that suggest they have been reflecting seriously on relationship dynamics. All these elements combine to create compelling performance of genuine vulnerability breakthrough. Yet this vulnerability is performance designed to restore your interest and neutralize your boundaries rather than representing genuine shift in their defensive structure. The avoidant has calculated that your exposure threatens to cost them your presence, has assessed that their typical defended responses will not prevent your departure or will not restore your investment, has determined that temporary vulnerability performance represents necessary tactical adaptation to manage the crisis their exposure created. They are providing the vulnerability you have requested throughout relationship, not because they have developed capacity to sustain vulnerability, but because immediate situation requires vulnerability, performance to restore your engagement and to prevent consequences their exposure threatens. The performance quality reveals itself through the vulnerability's sudden emergence and its equally sudden disappearance. The avoidant, who has been emotionally unavailable for months or years, suddenly becomes vulnerable in direct response to your exposure or your threat to leave. The timing reveals the strategic nature because genuine development of vulnerability capacity would occur gradually through internal work rather than appearing suddenly in response to external crisis. More tellingly, the vulnerability evaporates within days or weeks once the immediate crisis passes. Once you have been rehooked through their performance, once your boundaries have been softened by their apparent breakthrough, they return to typical defended patterns. The emotional sharing stops, the vulnerability disappears, the guarded distance resumes, demonstrating the vulnerability was temporary performance rather than sustainable change. The trap operates by activating your hope that genuine change is occurring. You have wanted the avoidant to be vulnerable, to share their feelings, to acknowledge their patterns throughout relationship. Their sudden vulnerability appears to provide exactly what you have been requesting, appears to indicate your exposure finally created the breakthrough you have hoped for. This activated hope makes you willing to soften boundaries you established, willing to give them another chance, willing to remain in relationship rather than leaving as you were preparing to do. You interpret the vulnerability as evidence they are finally doing the work to change, as sign that your patience is being rewarded, as indication that relationship can transform into healthy partnership if you maintain your investment during their apparent growth process. Yet the vulnerability performance delivers none of the actual change that genuine vulnerability would deliver. Genuine vulnerability shift would include the avoidant doing therapeutic work to understand their defended patterns, would involve sustained practice of emotional sharing rather than temporary crisis-driven performance, would generate gradually increasing capacity rather than sudden emergence, then disappearance. Genuine change would be maintained regardless of whether you soften your boundaries. The avoidant would continue being vulnerable because they have developed capacity, rather than continuing performance only as long as necessary to manage your response to exposure. The trap particularly harms you by teaching you to accept temporary performances as sufficient evidence of change, by training you that softening boundaries when vulnerability appears will maintain the relationship, by preventing you from requiring sustained, demonstrated change before you restore your investment. You learn through this cycle that exposure generates vulnerability performance, that you should reward through softening boundaries, even though the performance evaporates shortly after you have been rehooked. This learned pattern keeps you trapped in relationship where genuine change never occurs, but temporary performances keep restoring your hope that change is beginning. The vulnerability performance also damages you by creating repeated disappointment cycle. You experience hope when vulnerability appears. Finally, they are opening up. Finally, they are sharing feelings. Finally, breakthrough is occurring. Then you experience disappointment when vulnerability evaporates and patterns resume. They have returned to distance. They have stopped sharing. The breakthrough was temporary. This repeated cycle of activated hope, followed by crushing disappointment, creates emotional whiplash that damages your well-being, while keeping you oriented toward the avoidant and their potential, rather than toward protecting yourself and building life independent of their patterns. Understanding that sudden vulnerability after exposure is typically performance rather than genuine change allows you to recognize this trap and to protect yourself from being rehooked by temporary shifts. Genuine vulnerability development occurs gradually through sustained therapeutic work and practice, rather than appearing suddenly in response to crisis. Genuine change is maintained after crisis passes, rather than evaporating once immediate threat is managed. Genuine vulnerability includes the avoidant doing active work on their patterns, rather than simply performing emotional sharing designed to restore your investment. You must learn to distinguish crisis-driven performance from genuine sustained change by requiring the avoidant demonstrate sustained vulnerability across weeks and months, by insisting they engage in therapeutic work that addresses defensive structure rather than accepting emotional sharing alone as evidence of change, by maintaining your boundaries regardless of temporary vulnerability performances, until actual sustained change has been demonstrated through consistent behavior rather than through temporary strategic sharing designed to neutralize consequences their exposure threatened. Trap 2. The future faking reset, grand plans and promises that buy time without requiring change. The avoidant responds to exposure by suddenly becoming enthusiastic about future plans, about relationship milestones, about building shared life together. They suggest trips you should take together. They discuss moving in or making relationship more official. They talk about meeting each other's families or integrating your lives more substantially. They express excitement about shared future that they have avoided discussing throughout relationship. This future-focused enthusiasm appears to indicate genuine shift in their investment and their commitment. The avoidant who has resisted planning beyond next week suddenly talks enthusiastically about plans months or years ahead. The avoidant who avoided commitment discussions suddenly raises commitment possibilities themselves. The avoidant who has kept you at defended distance suddenly suggests increased integration and closeness. The future faking includes specific, compelling elements that make it feel genuine. They provide details about the plans, specific destinations for trips, timelines for moving in together, ideas about how shared life would function that make future feel concrete rather than abstract. They express enthusiasm and excitement that appears genuine, discussing future plans with energy that contrasts with their typical defended reservation. They may take small symbolic actions that suggest they are serious, researching destinations for trips, looking at apartments, asking about your family members in ways that suggest genuine interest in meeting them. They frame future plans as natural next steps in relationship progression, rather than as radical departures from their typical pattern, making the shift feel organic rather than strategic. Yet this future faking serves specific tactical function. It buys the avoidant time by resetting your expectations and neutralizing your boundaries without requiring any immediate change in their patterns. By focusing your attention on exciting future possibilities, they redirect your focus away from current inadequate behavior that your exposure addressed. By making promises about future commitment and integration, they create hope that relationship is progressing toward what you need, even while their present behavior remains unchanged. By generating enthusiasm about shared future, they restore your investment and your patience without having to modify their defended patterns in present moment. The trap operates through the gap between future promises and present action. The avoidant talks enthusiastically about future, yet their current behavior does not shift to align with the future they describe. They discuss moving in together, yet they make no concrete steps toward that goal. They do not look at apartments seriously. They do not have practical conversations about logistics. They do not adjust current living situations to prepare for shared living. They suggest trips months ahead, yet they continue canceling plans for next week. The future planning exists without corresponding reliability in present moment. They express commitment to building shared life, yet they continue maintaining defended distance that prevents the intimacy that shared life would require. The future faking particularly serves to neutralize the boundaries and consequences your exposure established. You are preparing to leave or had established that patterns must change, or you will no longer remain available. The avoidance future promises make leaving feel premature. How can you leave when they are finally discussing the commitment you have wanted, when they are finally expressing enthusiasm about shared future, when relationship appears to be moving toward what you need? The future faking reframes the situation from patterns are inadequate and I need to protect myself to patterns are inadequate now, but future promises indicate things are changing and I should be patient. This reframing keeps you in relationship tolerating present inadequacy based on promises about future change that never materializes. The trap also exploits your specific attachment to potential rather than to reality. You want to believe the relationship can become what the avoidance future promises suggest. Want to trust that their enthusiasm indicates genuine shift in their investment. Want to hope that patience will be rewarded with the future they describe. This attachment to potential makes you willing to ignore present reality, willing to accept promises as substitute for demonstrated change, willing to remain invested based on what might happen rather than making decisions based on what is actually happening. The avoidant understands this psychological vulnerability and exploits it through future faking that activates your hope while delivering no actual present change. The future faking causes specific harms beyond simply keeping you trapped. It trains you to accept promises as sufficient even when behavior does not change, teaching you that words about future are more important than actions in present. It creates repeated disappointment as promised futures fail to materialize. The trip that never happens, the moving in together that never occurs, the increased commitment that never develops. It prevents you from making clear assessment of relationship based on demonstrated patterns by constantly redirecting your attention to possible future that exists only in conversation. It keeps you oriented toward what the avoidant might become rather than forcing you to face who they actually are as demonstrated through sustained behavior. The future faking also typically includes built-in delays and conditions that ensure promises never require immediate action. The trips are planned for several months ahead, giving extended time before the avoidant must follow through. The moving in together is contingent on some future condition. After they finish current project, after they sort out their living situation, after some undefined future point when circumstances align better. The increased commitment discussions focus on eventual possibilities rather than on concrete near-term changes. These delays and conditions ensure the future faking provides its intended tactical benefit of neutralizing your boundaries without the avoidant having to actually follow through on promises that would require genuine change in their defended patterns. Understanding that future faking is trap rather than genuine shift in commitment allows you to recognize this manipulation and protect yourself from being rehooked by promises that will never materialize. Genuine commitment shift includes present behavioral changes that align with stated future plans rather than future promises without present change. Genuine increased investment shows through current reliability and availability rather than through enthusiasm about possible future that current behavior contradicts. Genuine relationship progression involves concrete actions and sustained behavioral shifts rather than conversations about what might happen someday. You must learn to assess relationships based on demonstrated present behavior rather than on promised future, must require that the avoidant's current actions align with their stated future plans before accepting those plans as meaningful, must maintain boundaries established through exposure, regardless of future promises, until sustained present change has occurred. That demonstrates capacity to actually build the future they describe, rather than simply using future faking to buy time and neutralize consequences their exposure created. Trap 3. The manufactured crisis, creating urgent situations that position you as abandoner if you maintain boundaries. The avoidant responds to your exposure and your established boundaries by manufacturing crisis that requires your support and positions you as cruel abandoner if you maintain the boundaries you established to protect yourself from their patterns. They suddenly face serious problem, health issue, family emergency, work crisis, mental health struggle that requires your presence and your support right when you have established you need distance or have communicated you are leaving a relationship. The crisis appears genuine and urgent, seems to require you to set aside your boundaries temporarily to help them through difficult situation, makes maintaining your self-protection appear heartless given their apparent need and suffering. The manufactured crisis includes elements that make it compelling and that make refusal to help seem cruel. The problem is serious enough that abandoning them during it would feel unconscionable. Significant health issue, major life disruption, genuine threat to their well-being or stability. The timing coincides precisely with your boundary establishment or your decision to leave, suggesting they need you most at exact moment you are trying to protect yourself. They frame the situation in ways that emphasize their vulnerability and their need for specifically your support. They have no one else to turn to. You are the only person who understands them well enough to help. Your absence during this crisis would devastate them. They may become uncharacteristically direct about needing you, expressing dependence that they have never demonstrated before in ways that activate your caring and your sense of responsibility. Yet the crisis serves specific tactical function beyond whatever genuine problem may exist. It interrupts your boundary enforcement or your departure by creating urgent situation that requires you to remain engaged. It repositions you from person rightfully protecting yourself from their harmful patterns to person cruelly abandoning them when they need support. It generates guilt that undermines your boundaries by making you question whether you are being too harsh or too unforgiving. It tests whether you will maintain your self-protection when maintaining it conflicts with their immediate needs. The crisis essentially forces you to choose between protecting yourself and helping them, betting that your caring nature and your sense of responsibility will override your boundaries when those boundaries appear to conflict with their genuine need. The manufactured quality reveals itself through several elements, even when underlying problem may be genuine. The precise timing where crisis emerges immediately after your exposure or boundary establishment suggests the crisis is being used tactically regardless of its underlying authenticity. The sudden shift from defended independence to vulnerable dependence, specifically during crisis, contradicts their typical pattern of handling difficulties alone without reaching out. The crisis resolves or substantially diminishes as soon as you have been re-engaged and your boundaries have been softened, suggesting the crisis was being amplified or was being used strategically to achieve specific outcome of restoring your engagement. The avoidant returns to defended patterns immediately after crisis passes without acknowledging that your support during crisis should generate their increased investment or improved behavior in relationship. The trap operates by exploiting your caring nature and your sense of moral obligation. You are a person who helps people in genuine need, who does not abandon people during crises, who takes responsibility seriously when someone depends on you. The avoidance manufactured crisis activates these qualities and uses them against your self-protection. You feel guilt about maintaining boundaries when they are suffering. You question whether your self-protection is selfish when they need support. You worry that leaving during their crisis makes you a bad person who abandons people when they are vulnerable. These guilt feelings pressure you to soften boundaries you established, to delay departure you were planning, to remain engaged during their crisis. Even though remaining engaged reverses the self-protection your exposure and boundaries were designed to create. The manufactured crisis particularly positions you as abandoner if you maintain boundaries, inverting the actual dynamic where they have been inadequate partner whose patterns necessitated your boundaries. The true abandonment has been their emotional unavailability, their withdrawal, their failure to meet your needs, their inadequate presence that required your self-protection. Yet the manufactured crisis reframes the narrative where suddenly you are the one abandoning them. You are the one being unsupportive. You are the one causing harm through your refusal to help during their need. This inverted framing creates confusion about who is actually harming whom, makes you doubt whether your boundaries are justified, generates guilt that undermines your clarity about needing to protect yourself from their patterns. The trap also exploits timing to maximize its effectiveness. The crisis emerges exactly when you have gathered the strength to leave or to enforce boundaries, exactly when you have processed enough to recognize their patterns are harmful and change is not occurring, exactly when you have made decision to prioritize your well-being. This precise timing interrupts your self-protective action before it has been fully implemented, catches you at a moment when you are committed to change but have not yet created enough distance that maintaining that change feels feasible. The manufactured crisis makes leaving feel impossible, right when leaving has become necessary, creating paralysis where you cannot follow through on self-protection because crisis makes doing so feel cruel. The crisis trap causes specific harms beyond simply preventing your departure. It teaches you that your boundaries will always be subject to exceptions when crisis emerges, that self-protection must be subordinated to their needs whenever they frame their needs as urgent. It creates pattern where your attempts to leave generate crises that pull you back, training you that departure is not actually a viable option. It generates guilt that damages your sense of your own legitimacy in protecting yourself. You begin questioning whether you are too selfish, too unforgiving, too quick to abandon when things get difficult. It prevents you from recognizing that functional, healthy partners do not consistently generate crises precisely when you attempt to establish boundaries or when you prepare to leave. The manufactured crisis also often includes subtle or explicit threats about what will happen if you maintain your boundaries during their crisis. They may suggest they will not survive without your support, will not be able to cope, will face devastating consequences that will be your fault if you abandon them now. They may communicate that maintaining your boundaries during their crisis proves you never really cared, proves you are not the supportive person they believed you to be, proves the relationship meant nothing to you if you can walk away when they are suffering. These threats manipulate through guilt and responsibility, suggesting that consequences of your self-protection will be so severe that you cannot morally maintain your boundaries regardless of harm their patterns have caused you. Understanding that manufactured crisis is trap designed to interrupt your boundaries and position you as abandoner allows you to recognize this manipulation and maintain your self-protection despite crisis. Genuine crisis does not conveniently emerge precisely when you establish boundaries or attempt to leave. Genuine need for support does not require you to sacrifice boundaries protecting you from harmful patterns. Genuine partners who face crises have support systems beyond just you and do not position you as only person who can help. Your boundaries remain legitimate regardless of whether the avoidant experiences crisis. Their crisis does not erase the patterns that necessitated your boundaries, does not eliminate the harm you have experienced, does not obligate you to sacrifice your well-being to provide support. You can maintain boundaries even during their crisis, can recognize that their patterns remain harmful regardless of their current struggle, can understand that staying to help during manufactured crisis will simply result in you remaining trapped in relationship after crisis passes, with no actual change in their patterns occurring. The appropriate response involves maintaining your boundaries, regardless of crisis, recognizing that if crisis is genuine, they need professional support rather than requiring you to sacrifice self-protection, understanding that their crisis timing is tactical manipulation designed to prevent consequences, their exposure created rather than representing coincidental difficulty requiring exception to boundaries, protecting you from patterns that will resume unchanged once their current crisis passes.